have been thinking about Dr. Peggy McIntosh's short article on the invisible knapsack for a very long time. And there was a prior article that came out the year before in 1988 with a different title, and that's what I first read. It was called White Privilege and Male Privilege, a Personal Account of Coming to See Correspondences. And the longer title of her essay is telling. This was a poignant essay about coming to see, as an individual, the nature of institutional power. And she was noting correspondences in her perspective between her own experience as a woman and the experience of people who were not white. White privilege was something that she discovered by listening to her colleagues and her friends of color. And when she heard, she realized something about what had happened to her as a woman. She knew that, in general, men set many rules, created the agenda, developed the institutions that she had inherited growing up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And so she then had to work with lesser female privilege. She understood that it was difficult for men to know as their reality was their reality. For most, it took some women saying to them, "This is what is happening to me." And so the year this essay appeared, 1988, I also started Harvard Divinity School. I was immersed in a completely different environment. It was scarily rigorous. I was plunged into a new life. There were a number of professors and students who all seemed to have this language that I didn't understand. There was camaraderie among people who had been to prep school and private school, and I had only been to public university. I felt like I was in a foreign land. And McIntosh's piece was a required reading in my first semester class, which was called Introduction to Theological Education for the Ministry, item. And we read and heard lectures, but most of the class was being in these dialogue groups where they purposely put as many differences as possible together. It could be a wide variety of identities: gender, age, work experience, race, class, sexual orientation, educational background, nationality. We had an incoming group of 180. It was diverse in multiple ways, and the groups helped us see correspondences and differences. This was considered an essential skill set of ministry. It was the mission of this divinity school, actually, to celebrate their founding for the purpose of religious pluralism, because it was founded by New England Unitarians. And I went there wanting to see something new. My life shifted drastically from being a Chicago professional dancer in July to being a Cambridge seminarian and a Boston Immigration Detention Center chaplain in September. People were looking at me like I was the minister. That August, I had also returned from a month in Central America with Witness for Peace. We went on a delegation to look mostly at the communities where people had been disappeared. I was still reeling from what I experienced, and spending that short, intense time in rural poverty was literally brain-altering. It was messing up my categories. We traveled among these Christian-based communities established in liberation practices. We were in the company of communities that were led by guerrilla warfare at times and responding to this military orchestrated death squads, and listening to the experiences of people in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. It changed my worldview. I just hadn't known what I didn't know. I wrote and I shared a diary at that time called The Gift of New Eyes. And it made me ponder class and educational privilege and see that my life growing up in El Paso, where I was 15% of the Anglo population, a majority Latino, Latinx city, this made me look at my life differently. It changed the way I approached Divinity School. It gave me these new eyes to see Harvard, Boston. Even my grocery store looked different. I was a little overwhelmed by all the choices. I'd been eating rice and beans and tortillas mostly for 4 weeks, and suddenly there was just so much food. Now, those of you who've lived for years in other countries know this much better than I, or if you have visited around the world, you know that the United States looks different every single time you return. Or if you are from a different country, you know that your country of origin can look different after you've lived in the States and returned and gone back and forth. Until you do this back and forth, sometime you just can't even see the differences. So in 1988, Peggy McIntosh's academic essay was the first naming of white privilege is hard to see. That is, if you are white or identify by others as white, because privilege is not that difficult to see for people of color because they live in the impact of the inequality in many systems every day that come from white privilege. So Dr. McIntosh saw it first by comparing it to male privilege. White privilege is to be like fish swimming in the ocean. What is water to a fish? How do you discern it? In her work as women's studies professor began to lay out these questions. She was a leader in the field of examining privilege. These questions that were not common conversations at that time in white circles, academic or otherwise. The first paper was personal. It was full of I statements, her discovery process, her uncomfortable realization. And then she began to invite others to look as well, to notice these additional correspondences. Was this like heterosexual presumption and privilege, which LGBTQ people certainly know extremely well? Was it like class awareness that's never named explicitly, but operates? Working class and poor people had no problem perceiving this difference. Was it like American xenophobia that just could not recognize the gifts of other cultures and countries? People in other nations knew this was going on for centuries. But we all keep forgetting the biases of our lens, of our constructed experience and the way we see. It is human. She suggested that the uncovering of privilege, this remembering, could be a lifelong project. And she invited us to see. Now, post-election, 2016, we're in the midst of a stark change. It's in this era of greater video, social media spotlight on repression and violence, inequality. And so people of color are asking those of us who are white to perceive differently. I heard a person of color say one time, Ferguson is my stone wall. It woke me up. It made me align with other people. It is the fire for my wanting change. And these voices are amplified in ways that can be challenging and provocative for white people who were just used to swimming in our own sea. The dialogue on multiracial perspective has already been shaping UU clergy and religious professionals for decades. And so we find ourselves in this conversation in our denomination and congregations, this conflict that's current in our denomination about professional hires or congregational life, social action, resource development. We know that the change has already come into intersectional organizing efforts that combine identities and issues for reciprocal action in a way that wasn't true in the liberation movements of the 80s, 90s. This transformation is bubbling up on campuses. It comes from students of all ages, as young as elementary school. And it's known more fully, I'd say, by people in their 20s, 30s, 40s. And so we are hearing strong voices of color that are Black, brown, Asian, Middle Eastern, Pacific Islander, Native American. They may at the same time be immigrant, prisoner, LGBTQ, poor, rural, urban, aging, young. They see this as a package. So we are in a new ocean, ready or not, like it or not. And any UU congregation which wants to grow and deepen is going to need to hear and respond. And so this is the debate of our times. It can be uncomfortable. It can be destabilizing for many of us who have had white privilege. I've been thinking about it for years, and it's edgy for me. It's okay to be surprised by the new waves, by the new voices. There's no need to just swirl around in a kind of passive guilt or shame about how we got here. We do need to know our history fully. We need to name what we see. And for me, there's no reason to stew in a kind of resentment or agitation about how people of color may be holding me accountable for something I don't think is mine. In my humble opinion, this is also counterproductive. Let this instead be a conversation about individual perceptions and actions, about multiple perspectives in institutional systems. Let's start learning. One person said to me after the last service, I don't get the emphasis on Ferguson because it's really not even the best example of police violence, in the case, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, stop. It's not yours. If it's a spark for a movement, it is their story. And he's like, I'm analyzing. I said, yeah. Those of us who are white sometimes feel defensive when we're blamed or attacked in our perception, and we immediately make our 10-point counter-analysis. If you want to grow, you do need to wonder what is yours in terms of benefits received and never noticed as a white person. You might be bemused by the intensity of the voices, I get that. You might be puzzled by these surprising experiences that are being named, but as my spouse reminds me all the time, it is not necessary to understand in order to acknowledge pain, to offer empathy and say, I'm sorry that it hurts. I'm sorry for the damage, you might say. I don't get this, and I'm listening. Now, those of us who are white could wonder if we are in the water and how we benefited. Our lens of perception has been shaped by whiteness, for most of us, in ways that are named and unnamed. And McIntosh stated one thing clearly that I think many of us over 50 can't debate. We were taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in an invisible systems conferring dominance on one group. What does that mean? Even if you have never made a demeaning sexist comment about a woman, if you were male, you still have advantages that came to you unasked. You may have recoiled at anti-Semitic hate speech, and yet options existed for you as a Christian, perhaps, that were not available for Jewish people. It would never occur to you, perhaps, to attack a gay or transgender person, but your state marriage license gives you privilege. Your gender assignment at birth that conforms with who you say you are gives you privilege. And so when we are white or considered white, we get this range of benefits. People of color have known this their entire lives. I think this is what they're saying when they note that we don't need to be a Klansman or a neo-Nazi to benefit from systems with deeply embedded ideas of the superiority of the so-called white race. So when we hear white supremacy systems, a term that's been used for decades in academic study of inequality, but which is now in the common culture, it engenders reaction, unfamiliarity. I think mostly the phrase is simply pointing towards this basic reality, which is whites are mainly at the top of the social and political pyramid. And they have multiple privileges that accompany this systematic ranking. I know we're all a package of identities. I know that some of my identities create less access than my whiteness, and yet whiteness always benefits. So I have this core belief about purpose. I think that our individual work as people who believe in freedom, as human beings on the journey, is to change and learn and grow. We white people could begin by considering that at least some of what we are learning from people of color may be true. And if it is, it could require new behavior. And as individuals, we might pause in our strong opinions. I have a lot of them. And consider if somehow our privilege is affecting our perception. We could let go of some cherished assumptions. We could sit in unknowing or investigation. We could get more comfortable with trying out new ideas, with being in a kind of beta testing, hanging in with unsettling voices. Here you can find collective purpose and learning together. It could be beloved conversations. It could be a worship leader, a workshop leader of color. It could be the January retreat we're going to have on the racial justice concept mapping. You might also find individual purpose in seeking sources that center the experience of people who are not white, from the margin to the center, requiring a slight step back of your own voice. Read different books, go to different movies, ask who you're not hearing, find public leaders of color engaging in this multicultural work, and then go hear them, and then observe what is uncomfortable to you. Consider if, even while you're uncomfortable, you might be hearing something that is true. Suspend your judgment for a while until you do some more reflection and study. Assume that maybe you don't know. And listen for voices in every setting that are not like yours. This week, I was so inspired by the story of a person who has listened in ways I don't think I'll ever manage. It turns out that Daryl Davis, the same amazing musician who's coming here on Saturday night, has an unusual hobby. He's covered in a new documentary about him that calls it accidental courtesy. Daryl Davis has sought out and conversed with over 200 KKK members, asking them to explain what they believe. As an African-American man, he wonders aloud to them what they fear about him, or as he puts it, why would you want to lynch me? And then waits for the answer. He has a dialogue that creates change in this very improbable conversation. The film about him happens to be next Sunday night here, shown by Serge. But I know another reason to be here for the Saturday benefit. Daryl Davis is a truly extraordinary human being. And I want to meet him. We need to hear him. The courage that it takes for an African-American man to sit down with 200 Klansmen. I was just in Charlottesville in August, and when a circle of neo-Nazis and Klansmen were in my motel, I went the other way. I didn't walk in and say, what is your belief? I ran. It's hard to fathom. His brave action calls me to this individual purpose of seeing my white privilege so that I can resolve to remember to see how this shapes my view. The front of the order service says seeing privilege. The inside says remembering privilege, because I couldn't remember the name of my sermon because it kept going back. Am I seeing or am I remembering? I don't know. I finally decided it's both. You see, you remember, you forget. You see, you remember, you forget. I want to keep doing this so that I can have the humility to let my whiteness move back and share some space. So I urge you to keep at this lifelong learning, this project, with intention, to find your own path, to name your goals, to risk stretching your own view. You're going to have to ask others what they see. You're going to have to listen to what they say, and this is part of what it means to live with integrity, to make justice in these times on purpose.